Uh, India is in a tough spot, right? I mean, there's no dodging that, right? I mean, I can
Yeah.
give you a lot of spin, but at the end of the day, we are in a tough spot. I'm actually waiting to see what happens to the resolution in the Security Council this evening. That is Friday evening.
Hmm.
Will India abstain? Because if India abstains, it could well be, because China is the only other country which is likely to abstain. It could well be that India and China are the countries that abstain. Although I'm told that the US is trying its best to get both China and India to sign off.
Hi, you're watching Hindustan Times. I'm Aditi Prasad, and of course, while for many, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine may be something that is happening very far away from India, fact is that in a global world, India has already started feeling the repercussions. The Indian equity markets have already taken a huge beating after several countries, including the United States, the UK, France, Australia, Japan, have imposed stringent sanctions on Russia. Now, the biggest casualty, of course, is likely to be fuel prices, which are expected to skyrocket given the pressures of a possible supply disruption. Edible oil prices are also likely to go up, we are hearing, given that Ukraine is a major producer of sunflower oil. And then, of course, there's LNG cost, there's food prices. Remember, Russia is the biggest producer, along with Ukraine, supplier, producer, supplier of wheat to the world. Now, I'm joined by Hindustan Times Editor-in-Chief Sukumar Ranganathan to understand the full impact of the of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on India. And but first, I want to start, Sukumar, by getting your perspective. Many people have been calling this a really surprise move by Putin, but moving troops to the Ukraine border and keeping them there for us as long as he has. This seems to have been Putin's plan all along, although he himself denied it many a times.
Yes, I think I think we should start off with a disclaimer. We are recording this at 11:30 a.m. on Friday morning. By the time you see it, it'll probably be late Friday evening or Saturday morning, by which time a lot of developments would have happened. But your question is an interesting one, simply because I think it was always clear to many people that the invasion was a reality. But I think everyone was optimistic about it, because when it comes to things like war, it makes sense to try and avert it to the extent possible. And I think everyone did what they could. My own reading is this is something that's been in the making, not for the last few weeks, not for the last few months, but for many years. And I think uh, there have been issues on both sides. I think what has really happened is that a lot of Putin's demands made over the last many years pretty much fell upon deaf ears. And I'm not for a minute justifying the invasion of Ukraine. You just cannot disrespect territorial boundaries like this. It's just not on. So I want to make that very, very clear, because then that means that you don't respect global norms. You don't. There is no global order, right? I mean, everyone can
Right.
pretty much do what they want to do, and so that's not on. But if you look at what's happened in terms of NATO's expansion, and Putin's concerns about NATO's expansion, uh, I think there was a lot of brinksmanship that was going on. Many people didn't take Putin seriously enough, and I think that's resulted in this invasion. But I think the writing has been on the wall for some time. If it had not happened now, it would have happened sometime later. So I think uh, it's unfortunate, but it is something that was bound to happen. It, of course, jolts the global order from the sort of equilibrium that it had gotten into, or at least seem to have gotten into. It's very worrying for Europe because for 30 years, I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So for 30 years, there's been pretty much peace and stability. And when I say peace and stability, I mean the collapse of the Soviet Union is effectively marked the end of the Cold War. Uh, and the Cold War was in many ways just an extension of World War II without as much bloodshed, right? I
True.
mean, it just followed on from there. And, and I think that those 30 years have been set back. The pain will be felt extremely significantly by the people of Europe and by the countries of Europe more than anything else. And I know in your preamble you started off by speaking about the consequences and the impact. We'll know in the long term, but there's just one broad learning or one broad perspective that I want to give. Uh, a lot of this will depend on uh, what NATO does now and how Russia responds to NATO's response. A lot of this will depend on the kind of sanctions that are being put in place, the uniformity that Europe shows in levying these sanctions. Because some of these sanctions could come back to hurt one European country or the other, and so
Hmm.
you need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So these are things that will emerge only over
No,
the next,
yeah,
and it's not even a question of days and months, right? I mean, in some
yeah.
cases, the impact is really long term. It's going to be felt over years.
Right. You spoke once or twice about the world order, being hampered. With the entire world in the West. This sort of for me, it's sort of a continuation of a repercussion of the U.S. failure in Afghanistan and the botched up withdrawal by Biden. In that sense, the supremacy of the U.S. is no longer seeming to hold water, even for Putin. I mean, the US has been urging Putin to sort of back off, but to no avail. So, do you see a new world order arising out of this after this, if there
Very
is
tough.
any order at all? Yeah.
Very tough to say at this point in time. I mean, we are just beginning to see the initial contours of the US response and the Western response. But let's assume that over a period of time, um, this involves uh, putting more troops on the ground in NATO countries. This involves uh, strengthening the equipment, the arms and equipment of NATO countries. If this involves going after Putin's cronies, right, the oligarchs, who have trillions of dollars of wealth, much of it is stashed overseas. And if would there be sanctions that effectively declare Putin and these oligarchs and these Russian supporters of his as war criminals, right?
Hmm.
Now, these are all very, very harsh measures, and if the West is united in doing this under the U.S. leadership, because clearly the U.S. will have to lead this, it could actually strengthen the U.S. Standing in this world order, right? I mean, it's a
Okay.
standing that's taken a few knocks after Afghanistan. But it was always clear that NATO was not going to send troops to Ukraine.
Hmm.
Ukraine might have hoped at some point in time that that would happen, but it was always clear that NATO was not going to send troops to Ukraine. The sanctions and the repercussions are largely going to be felt in other areas. Sure, NATO and the US might well choose to supply the resistance in Ukraine with arms and equipment, but that's very different from actually putting feet on the
Right.
ground.
And possibly that's the reason that the Ukrainian president, I mean, like just a few hours ago, his night speech, televised speech, he did say that he bemoaned the fact that there's no one standing by us, and obviously in a reference to the NATO and its allies. But let me just come to India, which is most important for us. The Indian response so far has been muted, clearly for its own real politic. Um, as far as the Indian response is concerned, what does this, or forget the response because that will take shape in the next couple of months, I think, a couple of hours or days, but we don't want to sort of preempt that. But I want to talk to you about what does this invasion potentially mean for India? Because, of course, there's the economic side of it, but also the real politics side of it.
Uh, India is in a tough spot, right? I mean, there's no dodging that, right? I mean, I can
Yeah,
give you a lot of spin, but at the end of the day, we are in a tough spot. Uh, but our response largely has to be driven by self-interest, but it also has to be driven by an understanding of what the inviolable lines are in the global order. Right.
right,
So India could well choose to either publicly or privately criticize Russia for violating the territorial integrity of a country, right?
hmm,
Which Russia itself accepted for a long time, right? You just can't do that. So maybe that is an inviolable line, but at the end of the day, uh, I'm actually waiting to see what happens to the resolution in the Security Council this evening. That is Friday evening.
hmm,
Will India abstain? Because if India abstains, it could well be, because China is the only other country which is likely to abstain. It could well be that India and China are the countries that abstain. Although I'm told that the US is trying its best to get both China and India to sign off. But even if we abstain, in our explanatory comments, we can explain why, which parts of Russia's actions we don't sign off on. So it's a balancing act that we will have to do at this point in time. The repercussions will be significant for India. I think not just in terms of the economics, because crude is already shot up, our budgetary math has now become dodgy with crude oil. Crude oil is now $30 above the average level at which we expected it to be in 22, 23, right? Let's put it bluntly. The economic survey said 70 to $75. It's now around $105 a barrel. So, although that was an average for the entire year, and the entire year which is not begun, because it's a year that begins on April 1. So, will oil cool down? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But there could be
hmm,
other issues also, right? I mean, I'll just present two. Uh, One is sanctions. Under CATSA, it looked like New Delhi would get some sort of waiver for the S-400 deal with Russia, that we would not be sanctioned. I think the likelihood of that is very low now. Right? That
okay,
will worry people in New Delhi. And I'm sure they're thinking about it, right? I mean, none of what we are speaking is not, we have very smart people running the foreign ministry in this country. I'm sure they're thinking about all these things. Um, but the other thing is, does Russia now become uh, the primary enemy, so to say? And I use the word enemy more from the strategic perspective rather than any other perspective for the US. Is it no longer China? Because for us, the main
hmm,
consideration is China. It's not Russia. These are things that we'll have to think about. Our response will have to be driven by self-interest, right? I mean, because even in the whatever global order, new, old, emerging, whatever we are talking about, at a certain level, it's every person or every country for itself, right? So we have to put our self-interest first. Um,
right. And as I said, we're going to keep this short, and so I'm just going to sort of cap up this with one last question, which is, would you really call this an unnecessary war? Forget everything else. The world is just emerging from COVID, a pandemic. I don't know whether we fully emerged yet or not. I think nobody knows. But there is already an economic cost to it, and then there is going to be the economic cost of this war. Can we afford this? Is this an unnecessary war?
See, all wars are unnecessary. Let me reframe your question for you. I think your question is really timing. So this is pretty bad
Yeah.
timing. I mean, economies were just recovering. Inflation is a problem. Inflation will become even more of a problem given the supply constraints that you're now going to see, especially with energy. Europe is going to be energy starved. It's going to see a rise in energy prices. Other commodity prices the commodity cycles seem to be cooling down, will heat up again. So the timing is bad. But all wars are unnecessary. No one wants war, right? Uh, and it's happened. Now we have to deal with the consequences.
It's happened, and and not just us. I think the whole world is dealing with the consequences. And of course, this every minute things are changing. As Sukumar pointed out, the UNSC big decision this evening for India and the rest of the world, and what's going to play out from here on is changing, as I say, every minute. So we will come back to you with more, and we will be coming back to you with more updates and perspectives. Stay tuned to HindustanTimes.com in the meanwhile.